All right, guys, let's talk about capitalism and the labor movement. And I'm going to throw in a little bit of communism for good measure. So, first of all, in the beginning, we started with traditional economies. Think back in the days before industrialization. People were farmers, so we got agriculture, and people developed skills in basic manufacturing. Like there was one person in the village who made clothes, one person who made shoes, blacksmiths, furniture. All this stuff was made by hand and by skilled workers. Basic services like butchers and doctors and sheriffs. This is all very skilled and specialized labor. In your notes, I would write down before industrialization, labor was more specialized and skilled. Put down some examples like a blacksmith or a shoemaker or a butcher. Along came machines, also known as physical capital, and you see pictures here of early machines like, you could even call a plow a machine, but like a mill or a water wheel. And with the Industrial Revolution and steam engines, like you studied last year, now we can bring those machines anywhere. And this leads to railroads and more machines and factories, which leads to the mass production of goods. The large scale production of goods using which factor of production? You remember land, labor, or capital? And you got it, capital. This is where the term capitalism comes from. It's an economic system in which capital, like machines, factories, or money, is the most important factor of production. And the benefits tend to flow to the owners of that capital. So think about mass production. Look at these assembly workers on a assembly line building cars. So they stand there all day, and the car sort of goes by them on the line, and they might have one job: to put the wheel on and tighten it up. And then the next car comes along and he puts the wheel on and tightens it up. And then the next car comes along and he puts the wheel on and tightens it up. And that's all he does all day. So what's happening to the skill level of labor once we add these machines in and we add in like procedures like the assembly line? Well, the skill level of labor goes from skilled labor, but to unskilled labor. So during industrialization, skilled labor is being replaced by machines and unskilled labor. For example, an assembly line worker doing one simple task all day long. So you might want to pause and write that down in your notes. Remember this picture we looked at the other day? The Luddites destroying the machines that are replacing them back in England in 1811. Yeah, that's how workers felt. These machines were taking their jobs and kind of destroying their livelihood. And this guy's taking an axe to some kind of cotton spinning machine. And sometimes I feel like taking an axe to my Chromebook. How about you? The story of John Henry from 1873 in the United States also is this symbol of the machine replacing people, right? The metaphor of John Henry as the working man he actually outperforms the machine. The machine breaks, but of course, John Henry dies right after he beats the machine. So people will, even though we have a heart and a soul, in the end, the machines will beat us down. Well, early capitalism is marked by lots of capital and lots of unskilled, low-paid labor, like you see all these people working on next to these machines in probably a cotton spinning factory or something like that. Lots of smokestacks on the horizon. Now, the advantages of mass production goes mostly to the owners of the capital, like the capitalists, as we call them, or shareholders of a company, or wealthy people or bankers who own the stuff. But also there is an advantage of mass production to consumers because mass-produced goods are cheaper. And so we live in an age of everything being mass-produced, and things are cheaper that way. Now, the late 1800 capitalists, guys like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Vanderbilt, were taking advantage of these new advancements in capital and new kind of economic systems. J.P. Morgan had more money than any of those guys, not maybe in his pocket, but he was a banker, so he controlled lots of money, and he believed in laissez-faire uh, government policies, which means that the government doesn't regulate corporations or doesn't have very many rules. And so this guy had more money than the entire U.S. government. In fact, he bailed out the U.S. government in 1893. Now, remember, this lack of regulation, this laissez-faire style, leads to more profits, but worse condition for the workers. Labor in the late 1800s, then, the workers, you can see in these pictures, they're often mistreated, they're underpaid, it's dangerous work, there's no real benefits, and if you die on the job, well, too bad. Children were forced into labor, working in these factories. And the benefits mostly were flowing to the top, the capitalists, the captains of industry, those guys at the top there. There is a middle layer of management, the guys who actually run the day-to-day operations of the factory and the coal mines and things like that. And then there's all the workers at the bottom, kind of that the whole pyramid depends on. So what's a worker to do? Look at this political cartoon from 1917. We see these guys. We see factories in the background. We see shipbuilders maybe and farmers. They're holding tools, and when they all put their hands together into one big fist, then they have a stronger hand. It's one big union here, and that's what we're talking about is labor unions. So add this to your notes for sure, is that labor unions, also known as organized labor, is a group of workers in a particular factory or in a particular industry who form an organization so they can speak with one voice. Now, this gives them more power to negotiate with the management, the bosses. So imagine, if one worker goes into the boss and says, "Hey, I'm not getting paid enough, and I'd like to have more time off," the boss will say, "Well, okay, don't let the door hit you on the way out, buddy. You're fired." But if all of the workers can come up and say, "Hey, unless you give us better pay and less working hours, then we're going to be out of here," and that gives them more power, one big fist to negotiate for better conditions. So early unions were things like railroad workers and steel workers and coal miners and workers in other factories. These were some of the toughest jobs, some of the most unskilled jobs, and dangerous ones too. I think this is like a cigar factory, probably in New York City, like in the early 1900s. Like, look at the close conditions and not so pleasant in there. Coal miners had it particularly bad, very difficult and dangerous work, very high fatality rate. So what is it that these workers organizing into unions wanted? Better pay, safer conditions, fewer working hours, and job security, not to be fired for no reason, but to know that they're going to be able to keep their job. And then later on, they want to have, later as workers get more and more rights and more power, benefits like health insurance or a retirement plan. But in the beginning, it was more basic, like, hey, a little bit more pay. We don't want to die on the job. We don't want to work 60 or 80 hours a week. And we want to know that our jobs are going to be there. So labor unions then would negotiate with the owners to get these things for the workers. And workers in a particular factory or a particular coal mine or something would be paying dues to be in the union. And that money then is used to hire lawyers or whatever they need to negotiate with the bosses to get better conditions. So how do the owners of factories feel about unions? What do you think these guys are going to say? So John D. Rockefeller says, unions? Yeah, no. Carnegie says, well, I can't stand them. And then old Chops down there, Cornelius Vanderbilt, says, crush them. Yeah, owners of factories and owners of businesses and the capitalists and the captains in the industry don't like unions. Well, why not? There's some disadvantages of labor unions. If you are an owner of the business, you generally don't want your workers to organize into unions. Well, why? Well, it's going to cost more to pay them. It's going to raise the cost for employers to have to pay them more and to let them work less. Higher cost means less profit. It means higher prices. And it removes the flexibility for the company to hire and fire workers at will. That job security that workers want isn't exactly what the bosses want. They want to be able to say, okay, we don't need you this month, see ya, and just let you go. Well, labor unions begin to form, and they're still around today. Here's some modern pictures, or more modern, and of course, unions are still around today. Now, Samuel Gompers was a famous union organizer, and he organized and became the president of the American Federation of Labor back in 1886. And the American Federation of Labor was not just a single union, it was a union of unions. So there might be some coal miner union, and there might be a steel factory worker union, and a railroad workers union. All would then join the AFL, which makes it even a bigger union and gives them more power. And so, by 1904, they had 1.6 million members, 4 million by 1920, and it's still around today and has almost 13 million members. So the American Federation of Labor. Now, these big labor organizations, and the AFL-CIO is the biggest one today, they have more political power. They try to affect government policy and laws that affect workers. So they're not just negotiating with the boss man, but they're trying to make change in Washington. Stuff like laws that establish a minimum wage or overtime pay. Like if you work more than 40 hours a week, they have to pay you more. Regulations to make the workplace safer, and rules about things like sick leave, like if you get sick or have to take care of somebody, that you can miss a day and you won't get fired, and lots of other things. Now, union membership continued to climb, as you can see from this graph, from the industrial time through the 30s. Pops up quite a bit because of the wages, because of the depression, I should say, and climbs through the 50s and 60s, and then it's been on a decline ever since probably 1960. So, quick bonus for you here. How does all of this relate to communist economic systems? Well, going back a couple of years, remember when we talked about different economic systems? And communism didn't just drop out of anywhere. It was a reaction to capitalism. This guy, Karl Marx, was alive at that time. And in Germany, there was industrialization was happening too. And he saw the unregulated laissez-faire capitalism in his country too. And he saw that the few owners of capital were getting very wealthy. Well, most of the people were unskilled workers, and they weren't getting paid well, treated like just replaceable pieces in a machine. And he forms a whole philosophy called, and we can call it communist ideology. He saw capitalists as these greedy capitalist pigs, and the whole system is unsustainable. He said, eventually the workers, who, by the way, outnumber the owners of capital, will organize, rise up, and take over the factors of production, take over the factories and everything, and then own them and run them communally. That's where the name communist comes from. The whole society will then share the capital and the wealth, is like the ideal vision here that Marx had. Private property leads to division because there'll be rich and poor. So in communist theory, that should be limited. Marx also believed that communist revolutions would occur all over the world and would spread. And that's part of the reason it was so feared in the United States, because we thought it would spread to our country. And it also is opposed to religion, which is not related to working conditions. But another reason why Americans don't like communism is because in communist ideology, religion is seen as a sort of a drug for the masses. The opiate of the masses is what Marx said. So who did this idea of communism appeal to? Well, you see the hammer and the sickle there, the tools of the industrial worker and the farm worker. And so the workers, of course, would like the idea of a more communist system, or socialist policies where the government is distributing the wealth more equally and is concerned about providing services to everyone equally, which in one country at least led to an entire revolution. In the Russian Revolution during World War I, the Vladimir Lenin led a revolt of peasants and took over basically the whole country, assassinated the Tsar or the king of Russia, and set up a whole communist economic system, which of course leads to the Soviet Union. And you might remember this story of the USSR, the largest communist bloc nation in the world with all of its little satellite nations there, and the Cold War and all that. But that's a story that you probably heard last year. But this is huge. It's, the Cold War affected history from the entire world history from the 40s till the 90s. It's this epic decade-long struggle between capitalism and communism. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Bye.